On October 27, 2012, just after 9 in the morning, Russell Coleman turned his 1978 Chevrolet C20 into the gravel lot of a dealership open house outside Terre Haute, Indiana, and looked exactly like the kind of farmer's salesman used in warning stories. The truck had rusted rocker panels, a cracked driver's seat covered with a tied feed sack, and 312,000 miles on an odometer that still worked only when the dash was tapped twice. Russell stepped down in patched brown overalls, a faded thermal shirt, and boots with fresh manure on the soles because he had fed cattle before daylight. Around him sat polished pickups with chrome wheels and low miles, parked by men in clean logo caps discussing trade-in allowances and delivery windows. Trent Halverson, the dealership salesman who handled high-horsepower accounts, spotted Russell and smiled the way people smile when they believe they already understand the ending. Trent wore a pressed blue shirt, dealership vest, and clean tan boots that had not seen a muddy feedlot. He shook Russell's hand for exactly as long as courtesy required, then turned to a small cluster of producers and resumed his pitch about growth through leverage, newer iron, and tax efficiency. Russell farmed 640 acres of corn and soybeans, finished 180 head of cattle each year, and carried no machinery notes. But local talk framed him as undercapitalized and one poor season from being done. Trent fed that story because it sold monthly payments. He walked Russell to a new articulated tractor priced at $348,000, flipped a worksheet on a clipboard, and pointed to the line that mattered. 10-year term, 8.4% interest, payment of $4,289 each month. Total paid over the note, $514,680. Trent called it manageable. He called it scale. He called it modern risk management. Russell looked at the number for a long 5 seconds, then said one sentence in a flat voice that did not rise or perform for the crowd. Debt is a drought you schedule. Trent laughed, not loudly enough to start a scene, but loudly enough for 3 nearby farmers to hear. The useful thing about that morning was not the humiliation. It was the arithmetic. Russell's philosophy had started decades earlier, and it had started with a legal pad, not a slogan. In 1982, at age 22, he leased 160 acres from his aunt at $72 per acre, paid in 2 installments, and planted corn with a borrowed International Harvester 1066 that smoked on startup. His first crop averaged 118 bushels per acre and sold at an average of $2.68 per bushel, grossing $50,598 before drying and basis deductions. After rent, seed, nitrogen, diesel, repairs, and crop insurance, he cleared $11,430. He did not buy a pickup. He did not celebrate. He split the money 3 ways on paper: 50% operating reserve, 30% equipment fund, 20% land fund. By 1985, he had watched 2 neighboring farms go through foreclosure hearings, and the memories settled into him like weather. One of those neighbors, Albert Crenshaw, had expanded from 420 to 780 acres on variable rate debt that moved from 9.5% to 14.2% in 18 months. Albert was a careful man, not reckless, but corn moved against him and interest did the rest. The auction lasted 6 hours. Russell did not speak during it. He stood by a fence and wrote numbers on the back of a seed invoice. Debt could outgrow yield. That was the whole lesson. His ledger from those years looked plain and relentless. 1986. Bought 40 acres at $1,050 per acre. Total $42,000. Paid cash from savings and 2 calf lots. 1989. Added 80 leased acres, no term debt, machinery repairs $5,740 total. 1991. Bought used. John Deere 4440 for $12,800 at auction. Paid cash. Rebuilt hydraulic pump for $460. 1994. Purchased first owned 80-acre parcel at $1,320 per acre. Total $105,600, paid with cashier check. 1998. Gross farm income, $246,300. Living expenses, $28,940. Surplus moved to certificates and land fund. 2003. Bought second 80-acre tract at $1,890 per acre. Total $151,200. No liens filed. 2008. Operating reserve reached $312,000 in liquid accounts and short treasury positions. 2011. Total owned acreage 640. Machinery notes 0. Consumer debt 0. Annual living spend $33,780. That sequence looks conservative until you run compounding in both directions. If he had borrowed $348,000 at 8.4% in 2012 and paid $4,289 per month, his 10-year cash outflow would have been $514,680, with $166,680 of that being interest. If instead he avoided that note and directed even $42,000 per year into land and liquidity, he preserved optionality in bad markets and seized distressed assets in weak years. Russell did not use the word optionality. He called it sleeping through rate hikes. As the open house noise faded behind him, Russell kept returning to one conclusion. If he added horsepower at all, he would do it on his own terms, with cash, and without a banker's calendar tied to it. Russell's private discipline was almost boring in real time, which is why people misread it. He ate lunch from a dented thermos and a wax paper sandwich, tracked every expense on yellow legal pads, and kept household spending below $34,000, even after commodity upswings. The farmhouse stayed a 2-bedroom structure with original cabinets and a furnace he repaired himself. Annual budget, 2012. Groceries, $7,140. Utilities, $4,920. Property taxes on home parcel, $2,860. Medical insurance, $8,760. Clothing, $620. Church and local giving, $2,400. Fuel for personal driving, $2,110. Miscellaneous, $4,740. Total, $33,550. He did not mistake low spending for hardship. He treated it as margin defense. He also maintained equipment, with a discipline most operators reserve for new machines. Grease intervals were dated on masking tape. Filter inventories were labeled in coffee cans. Wear parts were bought off-season when suppliers discounted old stock. In 2011, he spent $18,420 on repairs across the fleet. Neighbors with newer finance machinery spent less on repairs, but far more on depreciation, interest, and mandatory payment schedules. Russell tracked machinery cost per acre at $64.75. Two nearby operations, both running recent model tractors and combines on notes, tracked above $180 per acre when principal, interest, and service contracts were included. 3 days after Trent laughed, rain hit eastern Illinois and turned a consignment yard into churned black mud. Russell drove there in the same Chevrolet, bid card folded in his pocket, and stood in drizzle beside a dead 1979 Steiger Bearcat that had thrown a rod. Most bidders dismissed it as parts metal. Russell saw frame, articulation, rear end, and salvage pathways. Hammer price, $400. Hauling to his place, $350. He wrote both numbers immediately on the top line of a fresh legal pad and started a parts list in block letters. The rebuild ran 11 winter Saturdays. Salvage crank and connecting assemblies from a dismantler in Decatur, $2,480. Machine shop line bore and crank balancing. The only labor he did not perform personally, $1,150. Full gasket and seal set, $690. Injectors and pump service kits, $1,020. Bearings, hoses, belts, and filters, $940. Fluids, paint, incidentals, $660. Total rebuild spend, $6,940. All in cost with purchase and hauling, $7,690. Set beside Trent's financed path, the difference was brutal in its simplicity. One option demanded $14,680 over 10 years. The other delivered working articulated horsepower for $7,690 plus Russell's own labor. Even if the Steiger required another $3,000 in corrective work within 2 seasons, the gap remained massive. That is why the title number matters. It was never about romantic loyalty to old iron. It was capital allocation. By the first spring pass of 2013, the Bearcat was running warm but steady, and Russell was in the field while payment books stayed closed. People still called him stubborn. People still saw rust and patched cloth and assumed fragility. Yet the underlying ledger was moving in the opposite direction, line by line, acre by acre, with no applause and no monthly note waiting at the mailbox. That afternoon, with the Steiger still ticking heat through its exhaust manifold, Russell pulled into the North Terre Haute cooperative fuel yard to settle his spring diesel account. Mud dried in scales along the truck doors. The feed sack on the seat had slipped and exposed more cracked vinyl, and his patched overalls carried a stripe of black grease at the thigh where he had tightened a leaking line in the field. 2 younger operators in new hooded jackets stood by the office window comparing guidance monitors, and one of them glanced at Russell's Chevrolet and said, quietly but not quietly enough, that some men were still farming in 1978. Trent Halverson stood 10 feet away in a pressed quarter zip with a dealership logo, keys from a new demonstration pickup clipped to his belt, smiling that polished smile he used when he saw an opening. He told the men that reliability had a price and that cheap power always gets expensive in season. Then he nodded toward Russell and asked whether the old Bearcat had made it through a full day yet. Russell did not look up from the counter. He handed the clerk a check for $18,240. That covered his preseason diesel contract, paid in full before first draw at $3.04 per gallon for 6,000 gallons with no service charge. The same week, spot diesel in the county reached $3.39. His prepay saved 35 cents per gallon, or $2,100, simply because he had cash when others needed terms. He folded the receipt into his legal pad, said, "It ran 12 hours yesterday," and walked back out. The arithmetic sat in plain view, but judgment moved faster than math. Russell's discipline had not come from theory. It came from watching invoices become chains. In 1979, when he was 19, his father had financed a used self-propelled chopper and 2 forage wagons for a custom silage side business at 11.75% over 7 years. Principal financed, $41,600. Monthly payment, $734. In good weather, the business could cover that. In a wet fall with breakdowns, it could not. Earl Coleman missed 3 payments in 1981, refinanced the balance with penalties, and turned $29,280 remaining into a new note of $33,940. Russell sat at the kitchen table while his father did that paperwork and noticed the thing no one said out loud. They had paid for 2 years and still owed more than they expected. By February 1983, the chopper was sold under pressure for $18,500. The family did not lose the home place, but they lost margin, then sleep, then choices. Earl took night shifts at a foundry in Brazil, Indiana, and drove 42 miles each way to keep current on farm obligations. He never complained where people could hear him, yet Russell heard the house change. Quieter meals, fewer repairs, delayed decisions. Debt did not just tax income, it taxed attention. There was another influence, less painful and just as permanent. A widowed neighbor named Clara Whitcomb ran 210 acres with 2 sons who worked off-farm during winters. She bought almost nothing new. Her combine was old enough that paint had gone flat as chalk, but she kept it shedded, cleaned, and adjusted by the book. In 1984, she told Russell, while they greased a corn head in October wind, "Banks sell urgency. Crops sell patience." She showed him coffee cans on a shelf, each labeled with masking tape. Bearings, belts, sensors, hoses, emergency. She set a rule of 5% of gross into a repair reserve before any discretionary spending. If gross revenue was $100,000, reserve was $5,000. No debate, no exceptions. Russell adapted that framework to his own books and never abandoned it. He built 4 standing reserves, each with a target percentage and a practical purpose. Operating reserve at 35% of projected annual direct costs. Land fund at 25% of surplus net. Equipment fund at 20%. Tax and insurance reserve at 20%. In high-price years, he exceeded those targets. In low-price years, he protected them. The year-by-year sequence that followed looked unremarkable to anyone who valued speed over durability. 1983, net farm and cattle, surplus $9,860. Operating reserve funded to $6,000. 1984, off-farm welding income, $7,420, added to equipment fund, no pickup purchase. 1985, first used grain truck, 1969 model, bought for $2,200 cash, insurance liability only. 1987, corn averaged 132 bushels per acre on 200 acres. Sold weighted average $1.94. Gross $51,216. Net after direct costs and rent, $14,080. 1990. Purchased 55 bred heifers at average $640. Total $35,200. Paid from cattle reserve built over 3 years. 1992. Replaced bin unload auger with rebuilt unit, $780 instead of $3,900 new. 1995. Total machinery value on books $96,000. Liens 0. Annual depreciation schedule self-funded. 1999. Bought 160-acre parcel at $1,540 per acre. Total $246,400. Closed with cashier check. No mortgage filing. 2006. Treasury ladder initiated at $150,000 across 6, 12, and 18-month maturities averaging 4.7%. 2010. Liquid reserves and short treasuries, $1,120,000. Debt service expense, $0. Years later, at an auction yard in 2023, Trent would watch Russell outbid a room built on financing with one check. But in 2013, that balance sheet strength still hid behind rust and grease. Back in 2013, none of those numbers were visible in the parking lot. What people saw was rust. What they did not see was a controlled cost structure built to survive bad years without borrowing panic. By the second week of May 2013, Russell had finished corn planting on owned and rented ground and moved directly into his normal maintenance cycle, because he treated repairs as preseason insurance, not emergency drama. The Steiger got a post-planting inspection at 118 engine hours since rebuild. Oil sample kit, $32, lab report, elevated silicon but stable bearing metals. He replaced one intake boot for $46 and 2 hydraulic couplers for $78 total, then adjusted articulation pin preload himself. Total corrective spend after spring fieldwork, $156 plus oil and filters already budgeted. He compared that figure against Trent's financing worksheet, still folded in the back of his legal pad. 1 month of proposed payment on the new unit would have been $4,289. Russell's entire post-planting correction on the revived Bearcat was less than 4% of a single monthly note. His broader machinery budget that year reinforced the pattern. Total acres farmed in 2013, 640. Total machinery cash outflow, including fuel, parts, outside machining, tires, and allocated overhaul sinking fund, $41,920. Machinery cost per acre, $65.50. 2 nearby operators, both competent and hardworking, both carrying newer finance fleets, reported machinery lines near $187 and $194 per acre when principal, interest, and warranty service commitments were included. Russell never mocked that. He knew the pressure they were under. Their yields were often similar. Their fixed commitments were not. He pushed discipline into household spending the same way. In June, he replaced a failing water heater with a basic unit for $590 and installed it himself rather than financing a bundled home service package at 14.9% promotional interest after 6 months. In July, he bought clothing once for the year, 2 work shirts, 1 pair of boots on sale, 1 insulated coat liner, total $412. In August, he prepaid property and liability insurance in 1 check of $9,140 to capture a paid-in-full discount of 3%, saving $282. Every one of those decisions was small alone. Together, they formed surplus. Then came auctions, which were Russell's preferred classroom for price discipline. In September 2013, at a farm retirement sale near Marshall, Illinois, he bought a 30-foot field cultivator for $3,800, passed on a cleaner one at $7,400, and spent $690 over winter on shanks, sweeps, and 1 transport tire. All in, $4,490. The dealer equivalent that season listed at $18,900 used, or $27,000 new before tax. Same function, different capital burden. He carried the same logic into cattle. Instead of expanding facilities on borrowed money, he improved feed conversion through low-cost adjustments. Bunk space extensions fabricated from salvaged tubing for $1,120, windbreak repairs at $430, and ration testing at $280. The finishing group for 2013 posted an average cost of gain at 86 cents per pound versus 94 cents the prior year. On roughly 118,000 pounds of gain sold, that 8-cent reduction represented $9,440 retained margin, achieved without a single long note. By November 2013, the ledger showed exactly why appearances remained misleading. Farm gross receipts across grain and cattle, $612,480. Total direct and overhead costs, including labor draw, inputs, maintenance, insurance, and taxes, $451,930. Net before income tax, $160,550. Of that, he allocated $56,000 to operating reserve, $40,000 to land fund, $32,000 to treasury purchases, $20,000 to equipment sinking fund, and $12,550 to additional local giving and church commitments. No celebration, just entries in block letters. One evening that month, Trent stopped at the edge of a field where Russell was loading salt blocks. Trent leaned on the fence, looked at the old truck, then at the Steiger parked beside his shed, and offered a final attempt in the same tone he had used at the open house. "Asset rich, cash poor," he said. Then he invited Russell to a restructuring seminar in Terre Haute, a room built around one message: refinance now before rates move again. Russell set the gate chain, wiped his hands on a rag, and answered in 8 words: "I do not borrow to sleep less." Trent shook his head and left in clean boots. The next quarter, Russell walked into the same bank with 12 months of deposit history, treasury confirmations, and no request form. The banker who had once asked whether he needed an operating line instead verified balances. Demand and savings accounts, 800 mot, $24,000. Treasury ladder value, $1,116,000. Total liquid reserves, $1,940,000. Russell did not announce it to anyone in town. He asked for updated cashier check fees, thanked the staff, and drove home in the rusted Chevrolet, heater fan whining on the second setting, because another winter rebuild season was starting and he had work to do. He started that work the next Saturday with the shop door cracked 6 inches against sleet, a torpedo heater rattling in the corner, and the Steiger's side panels off again for preventive checks that no lender required and no warranty reimbursed. Russell drained fluids into labeled pans, cut open the oil filter to inspect for metal, and marked each finding on yellow paper in block letters. The line that mattered was short: no bearing glitter, no coolant intrusion, no deferred risk. He was preparing for spring without borrowing spring from anyone. What sat behind that discipline was the 12-year deposit history he had just carried into the bank, and those pages told a slower story than gossip ever did. The progression was not a leap. It was layered accumulation, repeated when prices were good and protected when prices were poor. 2014. Farmed 640 acres. Corn yield 176 bushels per acre on 340 corn acres. Soybeans 54 bushels per acre on 300 soybean acres. Cattle finish 182 head. Gross revenue $698,420. Total cash cost and overhead $507,860. Net before tax $190,560. Land fund contribution $74,000. Treasury purchases $58,000. Equipment sinking fund $24,000. Operating reserve increased $34,000. End year liquid plus treasury balance $1,318,000. By late August 2014, a retiring landlord in Clark County offered 160 acres at $4,150 per acre because two finance bidders lost approval after a rate reset. Russell bought it for $664,000 by cashier check, paid closing costs of $6,480, and filed no lien. Owned acreage moved from 640 to 800. 2015. Commodity prices softened, but fixed obligations still stayed low because he had none. Gross revenue, $631,770. Cost, $479,920. Net, $151,850. He directed $60,000 to land fund, $40,000 to treasuries, $28,000 to operating reserve, and $23,850 to taxes and giving. A nearby 80-acre tract came through an estate sale at $4,400 per acre. Purchase price, $352,000. Closing and survey, $4,210. Paid in full. Owned acreage, 880. 2016. Corn averaged $3.36 per bushel locally and squeezed everyone. Russell's gross dropped to $588,100, costs to $454,300, net to $133,800. He did not pause contributions. Land fund, $46,000. Treasury ladder rollovers and additions, $39,000. Operating reserve, $30,000. That winter, he bought a 200-acre parcel in Edgar County at $4,900 per acre. Total $980,000, using $520,000 from maturing treasury positions and $460,000 from accumulated land fund cash. Zero debt. Owned acreage 1,080. 2017. Better yields, moderate price recovery, and stable cattle margins restored room. Gross, $742,960. Cost $530,440. Net $212,520. He replaced neither truck nor house furnace, but he did replace worn hydraulic lines farm-wide for $3,140 to avoid in-season downtime. Land fund, $92,000. Treasury additions, $66,000. Equipment fund, $26,000. Operating reserve, $28,520. In November, he purchased 160 acres at $5,350 per acre, total $856,000, from a family restructuring sale where financed offers fell through during underwriting. Owned acreage 1,240. By the second week of June 2018, his acreage map had more pins than most people in town believed possible. That year, he operated 1,240 owned acres and leased an additional 120 on short terms, still with machinery cost per acre at $66.90. Gross revenue, $1,104,380 across grain and cattle. Cost $786,110. Net $318,270. He purchased 240 acres in two tracts at weighted average $5,625 per acre, total $1,350,000, funded by $800 to $2,000 from liquid reserves and $500 to $48,000 from land fund. Owned acreage 1,480. 2019. Wet spring, delayed planting windows, and two significant field repairs. One final drive repair on an older combine cost $7,840. A hydraulic pump failure on the Steiger cost $1,260 in parts and one full weekend. His notes read, "Paid once, keep moving." Gross revenue $1,021,500. Cost $755,940. Net $265,560. Land fund $108,000. Treasury additions $74,000. Operating reserve $49,560. Purchase 160 acres at $5,850 per acre. Total $936,000 cash. Owned acreage 1,640. 2020. Input volatility started to bite, and many operators increased operating lines by six figures. Russell did not. He cut prepaid fertilizer exposure, bought nitrogen in staged lots, and accepted slightly higher spot costs to preserve liquidity. Gross $1,086,200. Cost $804,900. Net $281,300. Land purchase 120 acres at $6,050 per acre. Total $726,000. Funded 60% from maturing treasuries and 40% from cash reserves. Owned acreage 1,760. 2021, spring close. Purchase of 100 acres at $6,400 per acre. Total $640,000 cash. Owned acreage 1,860. Bank-verified liquid reserves after purchase and seasonal input. Prepay $1,940,000. Those numbers explain why he could stand in old boots and appear exposed while being structurally safer than men with cleaner paint and larger cabs. They also explain why the social divide widened around him. For many neighbors, Russell's choices looked like refusal to modernize. For Russell, they were a risk framework. Keep fixed costs low, keep optional cash high, and never let a lender's deadline dictate planting decisions. Trent built his business on the opposite premise and sold it with confidence that was not entirely dishonest. New equipment did improve comfort, efficiency, and uptime in many conditions. The trade-offs became lethal only when price, interest, and yield moved the wrong way at the same time. Trent emphasized tax strategy, section benefits, and deferred principal schedules. He said leverage let good operators scale faster than inflation. He was not talking to fools. He was talking to hardworking people trying to stay competitive while land rents climbed and technology standards shifted. Wade Jensen was one of those people, and he had reasons. Wade ran 1,120 acres with his brother until a family partition required him to buy out inherited shares. He refinanced land and machinery together into a variable package that reached $2,300,000 at 6.1% introductory terms. Initial monthly obligation sat near $14,600. It penciled out with corn over $5 and average yields above trend. Then rates rose, reset clauses activated, and monthly debt service climbed to $22,400. Wade cut labor, delayed repairs, and sold grain into weak basis just to meet due dates. He fought for every acre, but by 2022 he lost 480 acres at auction. He did not lose because he was careless. He lost because fixed commitments outran margin when conditions changed. Loretta Pike made a different bet and met the same wall. She carried $910,000 in machinery notes at 9.1% blended after 2 trade cycles compressed into one refinancing package. Her dairy-to-beef transition had been sound on paper, and she worked from before dawn to after dark. But the payment stack was rigid, while feed and fuel were not. Her monthly obligations crossed $11,000 before payroll and veterinary costs. She sold her herd to avoid bankruptcy court, paid down secured balances, and rented out buildings she once filled herself. The county described it as restructuring. It felt like grief. Ben and Carla Mendez represented a younger version of the same pressure. They signed for a $2,000 combine and a $276,000 planter package with service contracts folded into financing. The combined principal of $678,000 carried payment schedules that assumed steady operating line renewals and moderate fuel. In the year diesel and fertilizer spiked together, their operating lender required additional collateral they did not have. Renewal failed. They custom-hired harvest to survive one season, sold stored grain earlier than planned, and watched years of effort compress into emergency decisions. They were capable operators. They were trapped by sequence. By the first week of September 2021, coffee shop talk had shifted from yield bragging to interest language that most farmers had not used in a decade. Prime moved. Variable notes followed. Floor plan costs rose at dealerships, and those costs rolled downhill into terms offered to producers. At the same time, ammonia and diesel climbed. Parts lead times stretched, and weather stress hit subsoil profiles in pockets across western Indiana and eastern Illinois. The crisis was not one dramatic event. It was a coordinated squeeze. Russell absorbed the same weather and paid the same posted input prices, but his structure changed the outcome. No machinery note, no land note, no consumer debt. He could delay discretionary spending without violating covenants, because there were no covenants. He could buy only what he needed when he needed it, and he could carry inventory when others had to liquidate. In spring 2022, he prepaid 40% of expected fertilizer with cash when local price dipped briefly, then filled the remainder later, reducing average nutrient cost by $41 per ton on his booked volume. On 312 tons, that was $12,792 preserved margin. His machinery line remained under $68 per acre, including fuel and repair allocation, while several comparable operations crossed $190 when principal and interest were counted fully. On 1,760 acres, that difference approached $214,720 in 1 year. That was not theoretical savings. That was cash available for rent, seed, labor, and survival. He did not stand aside while others fell. When Wade lost equipment access during restructuring, Russell lent a tillage pass and 2 weeks of labor with no invoice, then sold him stored feed at his own cost basis rather than market peak. When Loretta sold down, he bought spare gates and panels she no longer needed and paid the asking price without haggling, because she needed speed more than negotiation. When Ben and Carla lost planter capacity, he loaned a backup unit from his shed for one narrow planning window with one condition written on a notepad: return it clean and help the next person when asked. None of that erased their debt burdens. It did keep them in motion long enough to make better choices. By January 2023, the pressure reached institutions. 2 regional lenders tightened renewals. One local auction company posted a court-ordered liquidation list, combining repossessed machinery from 3 nearby farms into a single March sale. Trent still worked the same territory, but his pitch had changed at the edges. He talked less about 10-year packages and more about creative terms, because defaults had pushed his dealership's floor plan lender into stricter oversight. He kept his tone confident, yet the certainty had hairline cracks. Russell read the auction circular at his kitchen table, circled 7 units with a carpenter pencil, and wrote 3 numbers beside them: fair value, repair risk, and cash ceiling. Then he closed the pad and went to the shop, where the once dead Steiger sat idling smooth at low throttle, paint still weathered, articulation tight, ready for another season that would test everybody again. 2 Saturdays later, on March 18th, 2023, he drove the Steiger to the court-ordered liquidation auction and parked at the edge of a muddy lot where 7 repossessed machines sat in a row under gray cloud. Trent Halverson was already there with a clipboard and 2 financing packets tucked under his arm, moving from group to group with the same urgency language he had used for years. Only now he spoke faster and checked his phone between conversations. The crowd was smaller than expected and cautious. Everyone knew interest costs had changed the math. The first 2 units brought weak bids. The third stalled entirely at a number below transport value. Auction rhythm broke, restarted, broke again. Trent kept trying to stitch deals together in real time, telling operators he could still structure 7-year terms if they committed before noon. Then Lot 8 opened, the bundled package all together, and silence settled long enough to hear the auctioneer clear his throat. Opening ask: $700,000. No hand. Dropped to $650,000. No hand. Dropped to $620,000. 1 partial nod, then withdrawn. At $600,000, Russell raised his card. Another bidder pushed to $608,000. Russell answered $612,000 and stopped. Hammer. The clerk requested immediate 10%, then full settlement by close. Trent, standing 3 rows back, smiled as if this was the moment the old story would reassert itself. Cash flow shortage, bridge note, emergency financing, the same dependence he had always predicted. Russell walked to the table, took a plain envelope from his coat, and set down a cashier check for $612,000 drawn that morning from First Wabash Agricultural Bank. No cosigner, no line filing packet, no contingency. There was no speech. The revelation came from paperwork. Because bundled liquidations triggered additional verification, the clerk called the issuing bank on speaker in front of the court officer. The banker confirmed the instrument, and when asked whether settlement capacity remained for fees and transport, answered with the number that ended the argument in one line. Russell Coleman held $2,186,740 in immediately liquid balances after seasonal input prepay, excluding land equity and equipment. Trent said nothing for several seconds. Then he asked almost mechanically whether that figure included treasury maturities. The banker said yes, rolled to cash within 48 hours, already swept. Around them, the same people who had joked about patched overalls now looked at the rusted Chevrolet, the feed sack seat, and the mud on Russell's boots as if they were seeing a code they had misread for a decade. One younger operator laughed once under his breath, not at Russell, at himself. Before the clerk printed transfer documents, Russell asked for a microphone that squealed once and steadied. His statement ran fewer than 80 words. He said he was not reselling for margin. He said the 7 units would move out under 0 interest, 5-year lease-to-own contracts at his exact cost, with 2 conditions on every agreement: complete maintenance logs delivered quarterly, and 1 documented mentoring commitment to a newer operator within 3 years. Then he handed over 6 one-page contract drafts he had brought folded in his legal pad. If you want to know whether strict terms like that help or scare people off, subscribe now, because the next numbers answered it better than any opinion ever could. By the first week of April 2023, all 6 contracts were signed at the county office, with filing fees paid by Russell, so nobody started behind. The $612,000 purchase broke out this way. Ben and Carla Mendez, signing jointly but tracked individually for performance, took the planter package at $96,000, annual payment $19,200 for 5 years, due each December 15th after crop settlement. Naomi Price took the combine and header at $176,000, annual payment $35,200. Eli Carter took the articulated tractor at 100 feet, $48,000, annual payment $29,600. Tanner Holt took the sprayer at $84,000, annual payment $16,800. Josie Bell took the grain cart and vertical till tool at $108,000, annual payment $21,600. Total annual inflow to Russell if everyone paid on schedule, $122,400. Interest charged, 0. Late fee structure. None for the first 30 days, then documented meeting, not penalties, to solve cause before it compounded. Default clause. Return equipment in serviceable condition. Credit for principal paid. No predatory deficiency add-ons. The generosity was practical, not sentimental. Russell also funded starting repair reserves so each recipient could maintain without reaching for high-rate parts credit. Ben and Carla received $6,000 into a segregated maintenance account controlled by dual signature. Naomi received $9,500 because the combine carried higher wear risk. Eli received $8,000. Tanner received $4,200. Josie received $5,400. Total reserve support, $33,100, recorded as grants through his existing farm books before the trust was formalized. He required receipts, not gratitude performances. Results appeared quickly because the burden shifted from monthly financing pressure to post-harvest principal discipline. Ben and Carla reduced planting delay by 6 days compared with their prior custom hire arrangement, and cut per-acre planting cost by $23.40 across 1,020 acres, preserving $23,868 in one season. Naomi stopped paying custom harvest rates that had reached $52 per acre and brought harvest in-house on 780 acres. Gross savings $40,560 before fuel and labor. Eli used the tractor to replace 3 custom tillage invoices, totaling $31,200, and still finished his first payment on time, with check number 1184 dated December 11. Tanner's sprayer allowed timely fungicide on 640 acres during a narrow humidity window, improving average corn yield by 7.4 bushels per acre versus his 5-year farm trend. At a realized net of $4.62 per bushel, that yield lift represented $21,875 gross. Josie cut hired carting and tillage passes enough to keep her operating line from expanding, then paid her first $21,600 installment 3 days early. No one pretended it solved every problem. It solved the financing trap around machinery and bought decision space. Russell extended the same framework to earlier casualties without rewriting their history. In June 2023, he met Wade Jensen at a diner outside Marshall and finalized a fair leaseback on 160 acres that had cycled out during Wade's foreclosure period. Terms were transparent: $265 per acre, annual cash rent, 3-year stability clause, no percentage kicker, and an option to purchase if Wade posted 3 consecutive profitable years with debt service coverage above 1.35. Wade signed, farmed the ground, and for the first time in years entered fall without a renewal panic call. In August, Loretta Pike asked for help rebuilding livestock capacity carefully rather than fast. Russell, still operating personally and not yet through a formal foundation structure, issued a $48,000 zero-interest equipment note for handling equipment and feed infrastructure with a 6-year term and annual payments of $8,000. She bought only what she could use at current herd size, no oversized package, no dealer add-ons. By winter, she had rebuilt to 70 head, not as a headline, as a stable base. The deeper proof sits in side-by-side arithmetic, and this is where the story stops being personality and becomes framework. If those 6 auction recipients had financed equivalent equipment through conventional 2023 notes at a blended 9.25% over 7 years, total principal of $612,000 would have required approximately $10,010 monthly, about $120,120 annually, and roughly $840,840 total paid over term. Interest burden alone, about $228,840. Under Russell's structure, total paid remained $612,000 exactly, spread in annual post-harvest tranches, with no compounding interest and no forced trade cycle at year 5. Collective interest avoided, $228,840, money that stayed inside 6 operating businesses instead of leaving them. By December 2023, payment performance validated the contract design. 6 of 6 first-year payments cleared on or before due date. Maintenance logs were complete in 5 cases and corrected within 2 weeks in the 6th. Mentoring requirement status. Initiated in 4 cases, scheduled in 2. Russell flagged compliance in his legal pad with simple marks, paid, late, fixed, pending, because he cared more about behavior trajectory than polished reporting language. If you are learning something from this, hit like and share it with one operator who thinks interest is just a line item, because line items become outcomes. The next layer was institutional. In February 2024, with contracts performing and liquidity intact, Russell and County Council filed the Coleman Field Trust with an initial endowment transfer of $2,500,000 from maturing treasuries and retained farm earnings. Investment policy capped equity exposure, prioritized short-duration instruments, and targeted a 4% annual distribution rate with emergency override authority for seed and repair crises. At 4%, expected baseline annual grant and note capacity equaled $100,000 while preserving principal in normal years. He appointed a 3-person local board, 1 accountant, 1 agronomy instructor, 1 retired lender, and retained veto power only on debt-bearing proposals. His only hard prohibition was explicit. Trust funds could not be used to make down payments on high-interest machinery notes. From 2024 through 2026, trust and private actions combined into measurable acreage stability. Ben and Carla completed 3 straight profitable seasons, then refinanced their operating line downward rather than upward, because machinery was being purchased with principal-only payments. Naomi finished her 2nd payment cycle and entered year 3 with no machinery arrears, then mentored 2 apprentices through Harvest Logistics. Eli completed his first debt-free harvest cycle in full and filed his 2nd mentoring affidavit after helping a neighboring beginning farmer calibrate planting depth across variable soils. Tanner Holt, after 2 on-time years, sold his custom spraying side service and focused on his own acres, then transferred his mentoring obligation to a local high school agriculture work program. Josie Bell paid on schedule through 2025, then merged operations with her sister's farm under one conservative budget and kept the contract current. Wade Jensen, under the 160-acre leaseback, stayed current on every payment through 2026 and rebuilt working capital, to the point that input prepay discounts were available to him again. Loretta Pike kept the $48,000 note current and maintained herd health metrics above county averages, with lower feed volatility than her pre-collapse cycle. None of those recoveries looked dramatic day to day. They looked like ordinary solvency, which is what resilience usually looks like up close. By harvest 2026, the multiplier was visible across maps rather than anecdotes. Recipients and related operations directly stabilized or improved management on 3,480 acres without bank machinery debt. If you apply conservative land value of $4,625 per acre across that footprint, the operating base influenced by one $612,000 cash intervention, plus a $2,500,000 trust endowment, sat near $16,095,000 in land-linked productivity, under lower default risk behavior. That does not mean ownership transferred. It means fragility declined where compounding used to work the other way. Trent's resolution came without theatrics. 18 months after the auction, with defaults pressuring floor plan relationships and customer appetite shifting, the dealership reduced high-interest long-term packages and expanded used equipment inventory. Trent retired that fall. At a county breakfast, he told two former clients, quietly, that he had spent years selling payment comfort and had underestimated rate risk when margins tightened. He did not become a villain in memory. He became a caution in method. Russell drove home from that breakfast in the same 1978 Chevrolet, heater fan still noisy on the second setting, and turned into his lane past fields, paid for in full. Behind the machine shed, the once dead Steiger sat in fresh paint now. Not pretty, just protected, ready for another pass. He left the Steiger idling for a minute, listening to the steady low note through the stack, then shut it down and walked into the shop office with his legal pad under his arm. On the first clean line, he wrote 6 names and 6 due dates, then added one more column he had not used before. Second-order impact. He wanted proof that the mentoring clause was producing more than clean paperwork. By June 2024, that column was full enough to measure. Ben and Carla Mendez had finished spring planting on schedule for the first time in 4 years and reported 99.1% singulation across their primary corn blocks after replacing worn meters from their repair reserve instead of carrying the issue into emergence. Their gross crop revenue for 2024 closed at $1,184,300 on 1,020 acres, with cattle side income of $96,800. Total operating costs, including labor and land rent, came to $1,012,940. Net before tax, $268,160. December payment to Russell, $19,200, cleared 4 days early. They added $24,000 to working capital and reduced their operating line from $310,000 to $210,000 without extending term. Naomi Price's trajectory was quieter and just as important. She had entered the lease-to-own arrangement with strong agronomy instincts and weak equipment leverage, paying custom harvest bills that consumed margin in high-yield years. With the combine and header under principal-only structure, she harvested 780 acres in tighter windows, reduced field loss, and cut outside harvest expense by $43,680 net after fuel and labor adjustments. Her 2024 books showed gross revenue of $902,440, total costs of $731,980, and net before tax of $170,460. Annual equipment payment, $35,200. She stayed current and placed $18,500 into a machinery contingency account she controlled herself. She also fulfilled her mentoring obligation early, taking 2 beginning operators through moisture management, grain cart choreography, and daily service routines that prevented expensive downtime. Eli Carter's first year had proved he could operate lean. His second year proved he could scale without debt drift. The articulated tractor let him pull a wider tillage program and reduce custom invoices while timing field work around weather instead of contractor queues. In 2024, he farmed 690 acres, up from 540, with gross revenue of $771,120 and total costs of $625,300. Net before tax, $145,820. Payment to Russell, $29,600 on date. He then posted his first debt-free harvest cycle in full and signed a cash lease on an additional 70 acres using retained earnings rather than a bank bridge. Tanner Holt remained the most variable case because weather drove fungicide demand and side service opportunities. Yet his core numbers strengthened once his machinery burden stabilized. He farmed 640 acres, posted average corn yield 188 bushels per acre, and closed 2024 with gross receipts of $689,500 against $571,440 in costs. Net, $118,060. He paid $16,800 as required, and ended the year with no machinery arrears and no expanded operating debt. His mentoring commitment shifted into the local high school agriculture program exactly as filed, and 2 students later logged paid summer hours on cooperating farms rather than leaving the county for seasonal warehouse work. Josie Bell delivered the most disciplined record-keeping of the 6. Quarterly maintenance logs arrived early, parts receipts matched serials, and service intervals were documented to the hour. Her annual payment of $21,600 came in on December 10th, and her merged operating plan with her sister lowered duplicated overhead by $37,400 in 1 year. She converted that savings into soil correction and tile repair rather than lifestyle upgrades, raising long-term productivity while maintaining liquidity. The cascade effect became visible by the end of that season. 6 direct contracts at 0 interest had now generated 8 secondary mentoring relationships, reduced custom equipment dependency across a multi-county footprint, and preserved cash inside operating businesses. Total principal repaid to Russell through 2 cycles, $244,800. Delinquencies, 0. Aggregate interest avoided relative to comparable commercial notes remained on track near $228,840 across original term assumptions, and the practical number was higher once avoided rollover fees and penalty structures were included. By March 2025, Wade Jensen's leaseback was no longer triage. It was recovery with structure. He stayed current on the $265 per acre, rent across 160 acres, posted debt service coverage above 1.35 for a second consecutive year, and rebuilt supplier confidence enough to secure input discounts for paying fertilizer within 10 days. His gross for 2025 reached $512,700 on his resized footprint, with costs of $430,880 and net of $81,820. He was not where he had been before the collapse. He was solvent, stable, and sleeping again. Loretta Pike used the $48,000 zero-interest equipment note exactly as designed. No bundling, no prestige purchases, no hidden term extensions. Her annual $8,000 payment cleared each year. Herd size held near 70 head, with lower mortality and tighter feed conversion. And she returned one underused attachment early, so someone else could put it to work. In late 2025, she mentored Naomi on low-cost handling layouts for mixed-age livestock, satisfying her informal pay-it-forward promise before anyone asked. The antagonist resolution unfolded in plain county rhythms, not courtroom drama. Trent Halverson's retirement held through 2025, and he did not return to high-pressure sales in another territory. The dealership that had once centered long, high-interest packages changed under new management and floor plan constraints, moving toward inspected used inventory, shorter terms, and clearer risk disclosures in writing. Trent was not ruined. He had earned commissions for years and left with financial security. What changed was his framework. He began consulting 2 days a month for a regional used equipment network, and according to people who attended those meetings, his language shifted from urgency to margin preservation. He told younger sales staff that a payment worksheet without downside pricing was incomplete analysis. He said it more than once. Rate risk is not a footnote. In October 2025, at a farm breakfast in Vigo County, he walked over to Russell without an audience and kept his words short. "You were right about fixed burden." Russell answered the same way he answered most things. Math was right. They drank coffee, discussed parts availability for older drivetrains, and went home. No reconciliation speech followed because none was needed. By the first week of January 2026, Russell's own map reached the number people had once dismissed as rumor. He closed on a 160-acre parcel in Illinois at $6,820 per acre, total $1,091,200, then added 120 acres in Indiana at $7,050 per acre, total $846,000, both by cashier check after harvest settlement. Owned acreage moved from 1,860 to 2,140. Long-term debt remained zero. The cow-calf side operation stayed modest by design because he preferred predictable labor demands and cash conversion over expansion theater. His annual living budget barely moved. Housing, no mortgage, ongoing maintenance $6,480. Groceries and household staples, $8,420. Utilities and heating, $6,110. Medical and insurance, $11,940. Clothing, $760. Fuel and personal transport, $2,980. Church and local giving outside trust activity, $4,200. Miscellaneous, $3,870. Total personal spend, $44,760. He could have multiplied it without consequence. He did not. The Coleman Field Trust reached operational maturity the same year. Endowment remained $2,500,000 principal. Distribution policy stayed near 4% baseline, but actual 2026 outflow reached $138,400 due to approved emergency seed purchases after localized weather setbacks and 2 repair grants that prevented forced equipment liquidation. Since inception, trust-assisted grants and notes touched 3,480 acres under operators who remained current without bank machinery debt. At a conservative land productivity proxy of $4,625 per acre, that represented $16,095,000 in stabilized operating base exposed to lower compounding risk. Roll call in 2026 was unusually complete for a farm story. Russell Coleman, age 66, still farming, still debt-free, documented net worth $12,640,000 with land, liquidity, livestock, and equipment valued conservatively. Wade Jensen, current and rebuilding, no missed leaseback payment. Loretta Pike, herd restored to 70 head, 0 interest note, current. Ben and Carla Mendez, profitable 3 straight seasons, planter contract current. Mentoring fulfilled. Naomi Price, combined contract current, 2 apprentices trained. Eli Carter, second debt-free harvest completed, expansion funded by retained earnings. Tanner Holt, sprayer contract current, mentoring through school program completed. Josie Bell, contract current, merged operation stable, and cash disciplined. Trent Halverson, retired from high-interest sales, now advocating used equipment caution in limited consulting. Older names were accounted for, too. Albert Crenshaw passed away in 2019, never having regained his original acreage, but his granddaughter now cash-rented 60 acres nearby and farmed with conservative terms after Russell quietly reviewed her first lease draft. Clara Whitcomb died years earlier, and her 2 sons still held the home quarter, both debt-light, both known for meticulous maintenance that mirrored her shelf of labeled coffee cans. Earl Coleman passed in 2007 after seeing his son buy land free and clear, and that was the part Russell mentioned when people pressed him for philosophy. He taught me what pressure costs. If you want more stories where arithmetic beats appearances, subscribe now. In the comments, tell me one fixed cost on your own books that deserves a hard second look this season. Share this with one farmer who looks stretched, but still has time to change structure before the next rate move. By late harvest, 2026, the once dead Steiger was no longer weathered red. Russell had repainted it during 2 off-season weekends, not for show, just to preserve metal, and the new finish sat under dust by noon on most field days. It still started on cold mornings. It still pulled its load. It still owed nobody anything. On town days, the rusted 1978 Chevrolet remained in the same parking spaces, feed sacks still tied across the old crack, because utility had always outranked appearance in his ledger. People who knew the numbers had stopped misreading the signal. The final proof was never the auction crowd, or the bank verification, or the retirement of one salesman. The final proof was behavioral: fewer panic renewals, fewer forced sales, more principal paid from harvest rather than hope borrowed from spring. The farmer who looked poorest had built the strongest balance sheet in the room, then converted private margin into public resilience without speeches, without revenge, and without debt. When evening settled over the machine shed, Russell hung the shop rag on its nail, closed the ledger, and left the Steiger ready for another pass at first light. The next morning, before sunrise had cleared the oak windbreak, Russell reopened the legal pad at his kitchen table and drew a box around one sentence: verify every outcome in person. He tore out the prior year page that carried the 6 names, slid it into a manila folder with copies of the lease-to-own contracts, and wrote the date for the Coleman Field Trust annual compliance review. February 3rd, 2027, 8:30, in the old extension office on Maple Street in Terre Haute. By the first Monday of February 2027, that room smelled like coffee, wet canvas coats, and copied paper. Ben and Carla Mendez arrived first with a spiral binder of maintenance logs and a cashier check for $19,200. Naomi Price came in 10 minutes later with grease under one thumbnail and a ledger showing separator belt replacement, feeder house chain tension checks, and 3 in-season bearing swaps, all receipted. Eli Carter brought his $29,600 payment and a one-page mentoring affidavit signed by a beginning operator from Sullivan County. Tanner Holt and Josie Bell walked in together, carrying muddy boots in one hand and clean shoes in the other, so they would not track the floor. Russell sat at the end of the table in faded overalls and read each page, line by line, asking short questions and writing short answers. Ben slid a second sheet across the table when Russell finished the payment receipt. It showed their operating line history. January 2024, balance, $210,000. January 2025, $148,000. January 2026, $96,000. January 2027, $41,000. Carla tapped the last number and said they planned to clear it entirely after wheat double crop settlement if basis held above their hedge floor. Russell nodded once and wrote, "Trajectory stable, debt burden falling faster than schedule." Naomi's numbers carried a different shape. Her combine contract payment, $35,200, posted on time for the 4th cycle, but her key line was custom harvest expense, $0 for owned acres, down from $52 per acre in 2022. On 780 acres, that was $40,560 retained annually before variable fuel and labor, and she had redirected $22,000 of that into grain dryer upgrades that lowered moisture discounts by 0.4 points on average. She did not call it a breakthrough. She called it fewer leaks in the bucket. Eli's file included yield maps and 2 years of principal-only equipment payments already behind him, $59,200 cumulative, with no interest. He had expanded to 760 acres without adding a machinery note, and had built a $63,000 cash input reserve that let him prepay seed at a 4% discount. The discount alone saved $7,840 across his booked volume. He said the mentoring clause had forced him to teach what he was doing, and teaching had made him keep his own process cleaner. Tanner's report showed the most weather volatility, yet his fixed burden remained controlled. He posted gross revenue of $711,400 in 2026, costs of $585,900, net of $125,500, and paid his $16,800 installment 11 days early. The high school agriculture program he mentored through had now placed 4 students into paid seasonal farm work, 2 with Josie's merged operation, and 2 with Naomi during harvest. Josie's logs remained meticulous. Her merged plan with her sister had held overhead savings near $35,000 per year for 2 straight seasons, and she used that margin to tile another 80 acres without borrowing. At noon, Russell added all 6 columns on a yellow legal sheet. Principal repaid through January 2027, $489,600. Principal remaining, $100 to $22,400. Interest charged, $0. Estimated interest avoided versus comparable 7-year commercial terms at 9.25%, still approximately $228,800 par $40, now nearly fully realized as a lived outcome rather than a projection. He circled one more figure from the trust administrator's packet. 3,480 acres directly operated under these and related zero-interest structures, all current, no machinery defaults. Wade Jensen arrived after lunch in a clean but worn denim coat and sat across from Russell with 3 documents: his 160-acre leaseback payment receipt, his 2026 year-end statement, and his debt service worksheet. He was current again. Debt service coverage, 1.41. Working capital positive for a second consecutive year. Russell exercised the purchase option clause exactly as written and transferred title on 80 of those 160 acres at appraised value minus documented soil improvement costs Wade had paid from his own cash flow. Sale price after adjustment, $452,000. Financed by Wade through a conservative fixed-rate local note at 5.6% over 15 years. Not because Russell demanded leverage, but because Wade chose a payment he could carry at low commodity pricing. Loretta Pike came in last with a feed invoice folder and her annual $8,000 payment on the $48,000 zero-interest note. Balance remaining, $16,000. Herd held at 72 head through winter, with mortality below county average and feed conversion better than her 2019 baseline by 0.18 pounds of gain per pound of feed. She handed Russell one extra envelope, a handwritten note addressed to Clara Whitcomb's sons, thanking their mother for advice passed down through Russell. He said he would deliver it himself. If you have stayed with this story to this point, subscribe for one reason. Discipline looks slow until the compounding becomes visible, and then it looks like foresight. By late spring 2027, Trent Halverson's final resolution played out at a used equipment risk seminar in Effingham, where a regional network asked him to speak on sales ethics after the default cycle. The room held 60 people, mostly younger sales staff, and 2 credit officers. Trent stood in a plain gray shirt, no dealership logo, and clicked to a slide titled Payment Stress Test. He used Wade's and Loretta's numbers anonymously, with permission, and he did not soften what had happened. A machine payment that worked at $5.20 corn failed at $3.80 if variable debt stacked beneath it. A 7-year note became a forced trade cycle when repair reserves were empty. He said he had spent years selling monthly comfort and had underweighted sequence risk. He said it directly into a microphone with no hedging language. After the session, he called Russell from the parking lot. Russell answered on speaker while tightening a hose clamp in his shop. Trent said he had finished the talk and had told the room that old equipment plus liquidity had outperformed glossy financing in a rate shock. He asked if Russell thought that was fair. Russell said, "Fair if you also tell them maintenance is not optional." Trent laughed once and said he had included that slide too, grease intervals and filter inventory, credited to an Indiana farmer with a legal pad. That call closed the last open loop between them. There was no remaining score to settle, only a method corrected in public. In September 2027, the Coleman Field Trust Board met for its annual roll call in the same extension office, now with a larger map pinned to corkboard and colored markers for every active recipient. The accountant reported endowment principal at $2,642,300 after conservative returns and distributions. Annual outflow that year, $121,600, repair grants, $44,300, apprenticeship stipends, $31,200, emergency seed purchases, $46,100. Delinquency rate across trust-supported notes, 0. The retired lender on the board, who had once approved many of the county notes that later failed, said quietly that he wished he had required more downside scenarios 20 years earlier. Russell gave his own status in 8 lines. Owned acreage, 2,140. Long-term debt, 0. Liquid reserves after harvest prepay, and trust commitments, $2,011,000. Documented net worth, updated by independent valuation, $13,080,000. Personal living spend, $46,230. Truck replacement budget, deferred again. The room laughed softly at that last line because everyone knew the 1978 Chevrolet still started with 2 taps on the dash when the odometer stuck, heater fan still loud on setting 2, feed sack still tied over the cracked seat. Every named life in the ledger had an ending point that year. Ben and Carla remained profitable and finished their final planter payment in December 2027, then mentored a brother and sister operation near Brazil, Indiana. Naomi completed her final contract payment the same week and retained the combine free and clear. Eli paid his 4th installment and prepared to clear the 5th without refinancing. Tanner stayed current and accepted 2 students from the school program for paid summer work. Josie maintained on-time payments and expanded her merged operation by leased acres she could support without new debt. Wade reacquired half his lost ground and remained current. Loretta cleared the 0-interest note by autumn and held her herd steady through a dry spell without distress sales. Trent remained retired from high-pressure financing, consulting part-time on used equipment risk disclosure. Albert Crenshaw was still deceased, but his granddaughter still farmed her 60 rented acres conservatively. Clara Whitcomb had long passed, yet her son still ran the home quarter, with her labeled can method intact. Earl Coleman had been gone for years, and his lesson remained everywhere in Russell's bookkeeping. On a cold evening in early December 2027, Russell parked the Chevrolet beside the machine shed, stepped around a shallow patch of ice, and pulled the Steiger's cover back from the intake. The repaint from 2026 had dulled under dust and work, exactly as he preferred. He checked fluid levels, greased 2 fittings, and wrote one final line on the legal pad before closing it for the night. Paid for still means free to choose. The dead tractor he bought for $400 had done more than pull tillage. It had exposed a false equation, redirected 6 farms, stabilized thousands of acres, and forced the salesman to rewrite his own script. Appearance had misled almost everyone at the beginning. Arithmetic corrected them at the end.